We now move, councillors, to item number 13, Queen's Wharf Mooring Dolphin. And if I can ask John Smith, Project Manager for Cruise at ATEED, and Dean Kimpton to come to the table. Before we start, I'll just pro forma move the recommendations. They may or may not be subject to amendment. We've got a seconder, Linda Cooper. John, would you like to lead off on the report? You've hopefully had the opportunity to listen to what a couple of the board said about the dolphin, and you may wish to respond to that in your comments now or later in the session.
I'll certainly endeavour to do that as we go through, but feel free to remind me if I've missed out on any of those. I have a short presentation just introducing the report. You will recall that earlier in September the Planning Committee accepted a report and approved an outline as part of the Waterfront Plan refresh work and the City Centre Master Plan refresh work, which provides a view of the central wharves and the waterfront stretching through to Wynyard Quarter. Part of that addressed the future needs for the cruise industry and cruise infrastructure on the waterfront, and anticipates at some point in the future that there will be a need to have a look at longer term cruise infrastructure, particularly utilising Captain Cook, and we're working through with the ports of Auckland at the moment on endeavouring to make sure we align that with the port's master plan.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, hang on. Got a couple of others.
Okay.
Just to remind you of the context that we're dealing with, we have larger ships which are currently arriving in Auckland. The largest ship, 350-metre Ovation of the Seas, arrived in December of last year. It came here 3 times this year. Will come here again in this season and in the following season. It's in this region at the moment until 2020. It's being followed by further large ships that are arriving in the region, some of which are endeavouring to berth in Auckland. The number of cruise ship visits itself is rising continuously. We were at around 40 in 2006, so just a decade ago. By 2018, we'll be at 135. So the number of passengers, the number of ships continues to increase. And that means that the value to the Auckland economy continues to increase. It's currently at around $220 million. But as you would expect with the size of ships, the number of passengers and the number of ship visits, that'll continue to increase provided that there's infrastructure for them to actually be here. Back in March, the governing body and planning committee resolved to do some further investigation of a proposal for an extension of Queen's Wharf, a mooring dolphin on Queen's Wharf, which would allow us to moor larger ships. Since then, we've had an independent report by maritime consultants, and we've done some further technical assessments. Those reports recognise that whilst an inner dolphin, as it was referred to, a dolphin on the end of Queen's Wharf, has works in various parts of the world, that the Waitemata Harbour is particularly affected by tides and winds, and in this particular instance, the consultants have not recommended that as a safe solution, a workable and operable solution for large cruise ships. They are suggesting to us and recommending to us that we adopt what might be termed a dual dolphin approach, an intermediate and outer dolphin, smaller than the one that was proposed last year, and that be connected by a walkway to the Queen's Wharf, which provides for the safe passage of linesmen who have to carry the lines out to the dolphins. There are some additional works required on Queen's Wharf, which we've previously identified, including additional fender and some mooring bollards. And at the moment, we haven't done any detailed design work on this. We've done a preliminary design, but that requires an amount of testing and simulation before we get to a point that we could lodge a resource consent. So following this meeting, should we receive approval, we will continue on the process of that design work and preparation of a resource consent, and in lodging that, we would request that it be publicly notified and enable the public to provide submissions on that consent application. This particular diagram, which is included in the report, provides some perspective on how far the dolphin would extend outside of Queen's Wharf. As you can see it in relation to the extent of Wynyard Wharf and Bledisloe Wharfs. We have suggested and recommended that it be positioned about 80 to 85 metres off Queen's Wharf, and the detail design will position that in order to enable it to cater for the next class of cruise ships, the Oasis of the Sea, which is expected to be here within the next 5 to 10 years. Boffa Miskell, who are one of the consultants for the resource consent, have provided a very quick visual, which was requested at the workshop that we held a couple of weeks ago. It's not the greatest visual in the world, I'm afraid, but it was done fairly quickly. But it gives you a perspective of the dual dolphin and the walkway in relation to Queen's Wharf and Prince's Wharf. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, John. This could be quite a long session. I think there'll be a lot of questions. So let's deal with the questions separately from the comments. And the first councillor to indicate interest is Councillor Chris Darby.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. At the outset, can we have the questions that I've lodged in advance replied to, and can we have the questions of the respective boards and the public submissions from Heart of the City? Those questions you noted would be replied to. So before my questions, because I have subsequent questions, but are the first written questions and replies to the submissions from boards and Heart of the City.
Okay, I think all of us have received the questions that were emailed to us by Councillor Darby. Are you able to address those at this point?
I'll certainly do my best in that regard. I only saw the letter this morning, but I've had a look through it and have provided some notes to those questions on the way through. There was a question regarding engagement with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. We have, in previous instances, we have engaged through the Panuku Mana Whenua Forum, and with the working group of that forum, we've engaged extensively on the proposals around the mooring dolphin. We haven't, in the last, since receiving the independent report from the maritime consultants, we have not managed to consult directly with that forum again, primarily because we ran out of time at the last hui. But we have indicated that we will do that at the next forum, which is next Monday. And we'll continue to do that. Their interest has generally been around the detailed design of the dolphin rather than the form, and we'll continue to engage with those groups.
The question was with Ngāti Whātua, not the forum. Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, who have ahi kā over the Waitemata, and their feedback.
We've been dealing with the forum. We haven't dealt directly with Ngāti Whātua on this issue.
Reply. Thanks.
Yep.
Can I? I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I can make the suggestion, having recently spoken to Ngāti Whātua, they do not often participate in the forum for their own reasons. Can we request that you meet with them separately, because they are an important player in the Waitemata Harbour?
Very happy to do so. The second question was regards to the Panuku Technical Advisory Group and the Auckland Design Office. Both of those parties have been involved both in the Central Wharf strategy, which has looked at cruise infrastructure, and have been involved in the discussions around the mooring dolphin and its form in the past, and will continue to be involved in that process as we move into the detailed design process.
So specifically on the 85-metre out dolphin, I'm not aware of the Auckland Design Office being engaged. Has the Technical Advisory Group or the Auckland Design Office both been engaged specifically on the proposal, not what was earlier discussed?
No, they haven't. We haven't done a round of engagement specifically on the 85-metre proposal. so they're aware that we are moving towards a detailed design process and that they will be involved.
Sorry, can I just add to that? We do meet monthly, if not fortnightly, as an executive steering group, of which ADO has a presence in amongst other parts of the council family. And this dolphin structure has been discussed at almost every single one of those. So they will be aware, but the technical advisory group is not part of that. So internally, my full expectation is that the members of this organisation are across the issues. The external parties aren't part of that steering group.
Thank you. Please continue, John.
The next question related to any additional works on Queen's Wharf, and the proposal includes, as I mentioned before, a new fender and some mooring bollards at the southern end. We're not aware at the moment of any additional works that would be required, and those have been included in the estimate of cost.
Could you just repeat that? That's a new fender and...
Some mooring bollards at the southern end of Queen's Wharf, so the end that's nearest Quay Street. The bollards along Queen's Wharf are not rated sufficient to hold the size of ships that we're proposing to put there, and so we have to upgrade some of those. The next question related to traffic and the traffic from Queen's Wharf related cruise ships. The previous resource consents that was lodged and then withdrawn had a traffic assessment for Queen's Wharf within it. That was conducted by Becca, and Becca are part of the team that will continue to prepare the resource consent, and that traffic assessment will be revisited and revised in relation to this particular aspect. The question was raised about whether the 85 metre proposal changes the market economics in economic assessment that was carried out earlier. The issue for the economic assessment is actually the cost, not the distance. It's not actually the design of it that makes a difference, it's actually the cost of it. And the cost has not altered from our $10 million budget, so the assessment remains as current. The next question related to ferries. So we have previously consulted both with Auckland Transport Ferries and with Fuller's. And Auckland Transport Ferries have been comfortable that the minor changes that might be needed to some of the ways in which ferries access the ferry basin are well offset by the improvements that are about to occur in the ferry basin with the ferry terminal, and they've been stressed that they are very minor impacts on ferry operations. The next question related to the work being carried out by Statistics New Zealand and MB, and they have engaged themselves in starting to provide some official recognition of cruise passengers in New Zealand and the economics that comes from the cruise industry as part of the wider tourism industry. Both ATEED and the cruise industry who we work with are aware of the work being done by those two bodies. And we're looking forward to actually receiving that information as part of our suite of information that we do utilise. And it relates very much to the next question. So the ATEED's Cruise Action Plan is part of the visitor plan, the destination plan that's being prepared currently. We are in the process of going through a refresh of that Cruise Action Plan. And we're very keen to use whatever available information is possible to use, and hopefully the new information from Statistics NZ that will give us a greater understanding about the impact of the cruise industry on economies around New Zealand. And within that action plan currently, it certainly identifies higher value cruise tourism as being of particular value to Auckland and New Zealand. So those are the ships that are mostly smaller rather than bigger. But it also recognises that in order to cater for the growth of that adventure, luxury and boutique type cruising, that we really have to provide for the larger cruise ships at the same time. And they provide most of the volume of cruise passengers that are arriving and spending in the economy. So as I mentioned, we are in the process of refreshing that action plan. and hoping to bring that forward early in the new year.
Thank you very much. Chris, do you want to follow through that line of questioning?
So just in terms of the very first slide, John, you threw up there, or put on the screen, the refreshed implementation plan for Waterfront and City Centre.
Yep.
If we can come to that. I noticed that at page 161 on item 14, you've got a different slide, and Deputy Chair Charles Chambers referred to this. That is what we implemented, but I'm a little bit confused because at item 14, which is the America's Cup base location, we have the same header, but we have a different slide. So can we have clarification that page 161 is an error and this is the implementation plan?
So it would be worth stating that neither of these are detailed plans. They're strategic views about how the objectives for the waterfront may well be implemented. To date, we have not done any detailed planning around Captain Cook Wharf and how it might be utilised for cruise. This is one particular view about how it might be used. Within the Port Future study, there was another view about how Captain Cook might be modified by actually reducing the width of it in order to accommodate a greater number of ships and different types of ships at that point. And as we work through aligning the Central Wharf strategy with the Port Master Plan, we'll certainly come to grips with the more technical views about how many berths we need, to what length, and how that impacts on the wharves, and we'll certainly be bringing that back to Council.
Okay, so this is the implementation plan that was confirmed on the 5th of September by the Planning Committee. So can I go to the, look at that plan there? It proposes an embedded dolphin, which would allow for cruise, and this proposal today is for an 85-metre out dolphin, and to accommodate cruise on only the eastern side of Queens. Is that correct? And how would you accommodate cruise, for how long? Because this is termed an interim solution, so the economic impact assessment continually refers to it as an interim solution, and our implementation plan identifies medium to long term, with no dates, at Captain Cook. So how long is interim? And how does the impact assessment and the benefit cost ratio analysis reflect interim? I can't see anywhere that it's costed as interim, and what are the removal costs and what is the date of removal?
So if I can work my way through that. So this diagram predates the receipt of the independent report. So at that time we were still looking at a dolphin that would be on the end of Queen's Wharf rather than extending from it, and hasn't been updated since that time because it reflects the discussion and the agreements at the 5th of September. The dolphin as proposed with the dual dolphin and the walkway which extends off Queen's Wharf does have the advantage that it allows the smaller cruise ships that are on the western side of Queens to also move slightly to the north, which enables the beginnings of the changes to the ferry basin to occur for improved ferry efficiency, which otherwise we will have to wait for there being an alternative berth for those cruise ships. So it does have that advantage alongside it. The economic assessment work was done on the basis that it projected out to 2030. It doesn't project out further than that because it becomes a little bit dubious about how far you can take those benefits and what other things might happen around it. But 2030 is a reasonable sort of time to do that, to realise the investment. We have not at this stage committed to a particular time frame around the development of Captain Cook Wharf or any alternative longer term cruise infrastructure, and we'll certainly work through that as part and parcel of the work that ports are doing, looking at how what they need to do and when they can implement those works to release Captain Cook for those particular purposes.
So just clarification there, are you confirming that a ship moored on the east side of Queens then cannot be accommodated if there is a ship on a future Captain Cook on the west side of Captain Cook? It has to be one or the other.
There are a couple of different answers to that, Councillor Darby, and one of which is that if you had a ship of the length which we're showing in that particular diagram, it also has a breadth to it which would preclude utilising Queen's Wharf East at the same time. But if it was a smaller ship on both sides, then they could both be used at the same time. But one of the suggestions is that Captain Cook could be a narrower wharf than it currently is, which would provide some operational opportunity to use both Queen's Wharf East and Captain Cook West effectively. But the decisions on that would be operational decisions both by the Ports of Auckland, their pilots, the harbour master and the ship captains.
And one final question, Mr. Mayor. You spoke of the action plan. Is that effectively the cruise tourism strategy? So currently we don't have a cruise tourism strategy?
The cruise action plan is, if you like, a follow-on from the visitor plan. The visitor plan sets some targets for visitors to Auckland and the types of tourism markets that we consider to be important and of value to the Auckland economy. The cruise action plan takes that visitor plan and extends it into the cruise area. So from a cruise tourism point of view, it provides a perspective on where we think the industry is heading and what we believe to be the best ways in order to respond to that in an Auckland context. As I mentioned, although that was done only 3 years ago, the visitor market, the tourism market and certainly the cruise market move at incredible pace, and thus we're refreshing that currently.
So look, I just want to get to the nub of this. Do we have an effective cruise tourism strategy that addresses the sustainability of cruise and measures and understands the environmental footprint of cruise? I'm aware that a ship has just been launched earlier this year, which we're looking to possibly accommodate, which is 8,800 people are on this ship. Wow. And it burns very heavy crude oils. So it's that sustainability as well. Does that action plan address the sustainability of cruise in Auckland?
It's one of the areas that we've identified that it needs to be improved, and in the refresh that will be addressed.
Okay, we don't have it now. Thank you.
Okay, next question, Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And actually, Chris covered off 3 of the questions that I had. Yep. My last one is really, and it covers off what some of the earlier presenters talked about this morning, and that's one position that we can all understand. There's lots of moving parts in this wharf strategy, and it is complicated, and the interdependencies are quite substantial. So when are we going to land with a future position statement that we can all comprehend, and the whole cruise industry, Ports of Auckland, ferries, and it's all tied together? How far away is that? I know we've got parts of it.
So currently we have the Ports of Auckland who have released for public comment their draft master plan. That provides a perspective on what happens from Bledisloe east. And the area that is the Central Wharf strategy is the area that we are about to begin looking at with the Ports of Auckland to be able to report back to Council on how their potential release of Captain Cook and in what time frame that could occur will allow us to actually continue to develop the Central Wharf strategy, which you can see on the screen in front of you. So we haven't kicked that off yet, but we're about to, and we would expect to be able to come back to report on that sometime in the first quarter of next year.
the second question, if I may, Mr Mayor, and that's to do with the MB report and the economics around what we're doing, the Central Wharf strategy, what we're doing with the value of cruise, because I've got some information here from Cruise Australasia, which has figures that are probably 20 to 50% higher than what you've been quoted here. So is it possible, you think, to get one point of accuracy or truth around what these numbers really do mean? They're all substantial. It's just, you know, which ones are the most accurate?
It's always a difficult matter because there are different ways of including certain items or excluding other items in these particular processes. We have been consistent in using the market economics reports which are produced for Cruise New Zealand, and we always refer to those particular aspects, and we'll continue to do that because I think it provides at least a solid baseline for us to understand the impact of the industry. We are anticipating that Statistics New Zealand and MB work will effectively take over from that work that was done by market economics and then supplemented by the cruise industry itself. So there are differences between the methodologies that are used, but we try to consistently report from the same source.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure, got a few questions. First off, has there been any landscape assessment done? Because I note the comment in the report about the potential visual effects and amenity.
So as part of the development of the resource consent application, landscape, visuals, ecology are all aspects that we address, and we have done that before in relation to the previous proposal, and Boff and Miskell are part of the team producing that particular aspect, and that will be part of the application.
Okay, and the other question goes to the larger size of vessels. I note on page 40 or page 50 of our agenda the geotechnical capacity that's mentioned around the piles. Does it follow that we're going to need to spend significantly more money on the wharf to accommodate these larger vessels over and above what we're already considering?
Since we received the independent report from the maritime consultants who raised the question about the structural capacity of the wharf to accommodate larger vessels, we have had Becca, or Ports of Auckland I should say, have had Becca had a further look at the capacity of the wharf, and they advise us that the works which we anticipate to be part of the mooring dolphin, which is the dolphin itself, the fenders and the mooring bollards, will be sufficient to hold those particular vessels.
Okay, another question just around the impact of the dolphin. Is that effectively going to mean that that dolphin is going to push traffic further out into the harbour? I'm thinking of the ferries in the vicinity and so on.
If you stand on the end of Queen's Wharf on any given day, you will notice that some of the ferries approach up the channel and take a very wide arc into the ferry basin. Others of them, particularly the Devonport Kia, when it's operating, does actually tend to try to cut the corner a little bit.
Sure.
So the minor impact that I referred to previously that Auckland Transport Ferries have discussed with us is predominantly to the operation of the Kia, which might have to come at a slightly wider arc. But for the rest of the ferries, they're usually trying to navigate their way into the basin by avoiding ferries that are actually departing at the same time. So they do take a wide arc into that area, and this really won't have much difference to what their current trajectory is.
Okay, and the other question I've got just goes to the necessity for the gangway or the walkway. Is it not conceivable that you could use technology around drones to locate the light line to the dolphin? I mean, don't laugh, fellow councillors. I mean, this technology is here, and there are many applications that are similar that use that technology.
They're called boats.
I'd have to say that I'd be speculating to be able to answer that particular question. But what I can answer is that even with a form of technology that might be suggesting, or that we haven't thought of, that still takes human intervention to actually manoeuvre the rope around a capstan or a bollard in order to secure the vessel, which means a person has to actually access the dolphin itself, and that's the issue that's been raised for the Ports of Auckland by the risk assessment consultants that they engaged, and it's actually the safety of those humans that have to find their way out to the dolphin that is of critical importance from a health and safety perspective.
And just one last question, and that's just around cost recovery. Are we going to recover the cost of the dolphin over the life of the dolphin, given that, as Councillor Darby mentions, it's essentially temporary?
So we've done some calculations on the amount of and who the levy might apply to, and we've provided that to Ports of Auckland for a discussion around what is appropriate and how we might treat that. We've varied the amount, and we've varied whether it would apply to all cruise passengers or only those who are on the particular vessels that are using the mooring dolphin. And as you would expect, you get different periods of return on that investment. I think the shortest period that we have looked at is about 7 or so years on that, and the longest runs out to about 20 years. So we're not at a point yet to be able to advise on exactly what's going to be acceptable, both to the Ports of Auckland who have to collect it and the cruise industry who have to provide that funding.
We do, through the chair, we do have a recommendation though that that the costs are recovered through Ports of Auckland, that it applies to cruise-related infrastructure, because remember, to provide for these larger vessels, they're not just using the Dolphin, but they're also using the strengthened Queen's Wharf, and we would encourage you to contemplate applying that to all passengers that use that wharf facility.
Can I just ask a supplementary? A couple of people have talked about the dolphins being temporary. Is it in fact intended that the dolphins are temporary if, as you say, it is intended that you would continue to use the west side of Queen's Wharf if you had a dolphin, even after the ferry terminal is put in? And if you are you going to need the dolphin, and are you going to need Queen's Wharf in the event that Captain Cook's Wharf was extended to cater for the longer ships?
We have not referred to the dolphins as being temporary in the resource consent work that we've done previously, or in this round we wouldn't intend to either. That has certain connotations in relation to resource consent, and we would see the facility as being there as part of the resilience for cruise infrastructure in the longer term. Without a perspective exactly on what time frame we would deliver Captain Cook, it's a bit difficult to put any time limits around when it would be utilised and for how long.
Thank you. Councillor Rosscliffe.
So, that's interesting.
One thing I find it's in common with this report as well as the next one on the America's Cup is we seem to be dancing to the tune of a different piper, and it's not necessarily the Auckland public. So we've got one that's Team New Zealand, of course we're all behind them and all that, but they're a separate entity, and here we've got the cruise industry, and to a degree we've got another little island state called the Ports of Auckland. We seem to be dancing to their tune at the same time. So I'm just most uncomfortable that we seem to be just these reactive decision making, and as Heart of the City and Viv pointed out, as did the local boards, we're just reacting. We're just doing it ad hoc. It's not the way we should be doing this. So I'm hearing now the Dolphin may not be demolished. The resource consent is putting it in as a permanent structure, 90 metres out.
So sorry, I need a question from that,
and the question is, the cost of the Dolphin and the related Queen's expenses, that's the first question. I have 4 of them actually. So what is the total cost of, talking about the fenders and et cetera, and any other changes?
So we have budgeted for a total cost of $10 million. That includes a contingency within it, because to date we have not got to a detailed design, and so it comes out at around that figure.
And I'm in my 4th year and we've been looking at the port strategies down there. So Captain Cook Wharf extension, what would be the very best case scenario if we ended up with total cooperation from our 100% owned company, which we have a lot of influence over? What would be the best case scenario for us being able to extend Captain Cook, if that's what we wanted to do?
So again, I preface a response to that on the basis that we don't have a detailed design for Captain Cook, so it's difficult to understand how long it would take to actually construct something, and let alone achieve a consent for it. But the discussions that we've had with the Ports of Auckland would indicate that possibly the most optimistic view of delivery of the infrastructure which they require in order to be able to remove themselves from Captain Cook use would be about the middle of the next decade, so somewhere around 2025, at which point we would still need to construct the infrastructure that we would require for cruise. So you're probably looking towards the end of the next decade.
So let's just round it up. So John, you're saying basically within a decade we could have Captain Cook up and running, and therefore would take care of the scenario for the large ships. Is that correct?
If everything ran to a favourable time frame, that could well be the case.
So I just want to, and I don't know who can ask the question, but what happens to these very large ships when they go to the Outer Pines, Lefo in New Caledonia and various other islands, or indeed in the Mediterranean, where often facilities are terribly basic? And I've been to a number of those places, been very lucky, and I see the ships out in the water and people more than happy to get in a lighter and just come on in, and there's really, all I've seen, and also some incredibly basic sort of wharves in New Caledonia where not the bigger ships more too, but people seem quite happy to get by. What do they do in those areas where the infrastructure will never be great because those island states can never afford it?
Indeed, in New Zealand we have ports where cruise ships call which don't have infrastructure sufficient for cruise ships to berth alongside. Bay of Islands and Akaroa are two of those locations around New Zealand. And the reflection is that Auckland is not just a port similar to Akaroa or Bay of Islands. It's a hub port, it's an exchange port, it's a provisioning port. And that reflects in the economic benefit that's generated in New Zealand, which the economic benefit figures from the market economics work are about $550 million to the New Zealand economy, of which Auckland receives close to 60% of that particular economic benefit. And those ports which don't have the infrastructure to provide have a much reduced economic benefit to their communities. It's still of benefit, but it's certainly not to the extent that you do when cruise ships can berth alongside.
So John, have you got any indication that the industry, if we were not to really do anything for 10 years, certainly some ships would not be here, but would they go forever, or would they come back? Is Auckland not attractive to come back to?
There are two indications from the discussions that we've had with the cruise industry and with people who've kept track about what happens with cruise industry worldwide. One is the experience of the Alaskan cruises, where one of the ports decided to impose significant increase in costs and charges, and the cruise companies resolved to go to a port not very far down the coast as an alternative, and the view is that it took 15 years for them to recover. Once they'd rescinded that decision, it took them about 15 years to get back to where they were, and had not received the benefits of growth in that particular market over that particular time. So that's one anecdote that we have, or an example that we have. Sorry, I lost track of the second part of that question. It relates to the cruise vessels themselves. One of the things that is happening is not just a an addition of a new large cruise vessel on top of the existing cruise vessels that we have. These larger cruise vessels are here because they are plying the Asian market, and they're coming to Australasia because we're close by and we're a very steady and good yielding market for the cruise industry. So they're starting to bring these large vessels from the Asian market to Australasia. And in doing that, what's happening is they're displacing the smaller and older vessels that we have seen coming here over the last 10 or 20 years. So the expectation in the cruise industry is that some of those mid-size vessels that we currently see will not stay in this region. If we're unable to berth the larger cruise ships, then the impact of that is that we will get fewer port calls by cruise ships rather than there being a growth as we anticipate if the infrastructure is available.
So I was a little bit confused there. I got the impression you indicated the medium ships would stop coming here. We'd only get the big ones. What if the big ones couldn't come? We're going to lose the medium ones, because what proportion of the big ships going to be of the total amount of cruise ship activity?
So
is it 20% of the activity, turnover, 50?
So the scenarios that we work through with the cruise industry, which Market Economics did for ATEED earlier this year, took as if you like, the baseline status quo or low growth scenario, a view that we didn't have infrastructure for larger ships, and that saw an effective flatlining of the cruise industry, both in terms of the number of ships, passengers, and the economic value, compared to what is effectively a doubling of all of those over the next 15 years or so, if we do have the infrastructure to cater for them. And the impact is generally that larger ships are going to displace the mid-sized ships that currently come here, and they won't be able to come here if we don't have the infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Just like to throw in a couple of questions, if I may, at this point. I think at the previous Planning Committee meeting that voted on this, the inner dolphin was preferred, and councillors expressed a desire not to have a walkway, or many councillors did. Can you confirm whether this governing body has the ability to override the Ports of Auckland or the Harbour Master on, one, whether an outer dolphin is required, and two, whether a walkway is required?
My understanding is that the decision on the safe operation of berthing infrastructure is a decision that's made by a number of parties. One of those parties is the Ports of Auckland as the operator of the cruise terminal, and Ports of Auckland is a standalone entity which has its own board. Another party is the Ports of Auckland pilots, who have their own statutory responsibilities for the safe passage of ships. A third entity is the Harbour Master, who has the responsibility for the safety of vessels in the channel and in the harbour, and for ships over 320 metres in length, has to provide their own approval to those ships to enter into the harbour, and that's done on a ship-by-ship basis. And the last entity is the cruise line ship captain themselves, who has a requirement to ensure the safety of the vessel at port. In essence, whilst the governing body would have the ability to agree to a particular infrastructure being built, the question about whether it is actually used is a question that sits outside of this body.
Okay, so let me try and get my head around what you said. In essence, if the Harbour Master says we need a dolphin to bring a larger cruise ship in, and we don't provide the dolphin, he won't allow it in?
Correct.
That's correct? Okay, and if the Ports of Auckland contrary to the common sense that many of us feel about the walkway, says that they have to have a walkway and they're not going to operate it unless they've got a walkway. They have the final decision in that regard.
Health and
Okay,
safety.
so that limits the scope of what this governing body is able to do. The second thing I just want you to clarify, maybe just with a bit more empirical evidence, what you mentioned to Councillor Clow. My understanding is that the majority of new cruise ships being built are of the longer variety, and over time our inability to berth the longer ships mean that instead of our ship visits going up, our expenditure going up, our employment going up, it would at best flatline. Is that what you told us?
Absolutely correct.
Okay. The third thing that I wanted to check out with you, there are, and it really goes back to what the Deputy Chair of the local board was questioning about. His question was, if you don't need, if these ships, the Oasis class ships might not arrive for 5 to 10 years, is that correct? Mm-hmm. You're saying we won't have we're not likely to have a Captain Cook Wharf alternative till the late 2020s, which is 10, 12 years away? Okay. So do you have an option? The original proposal was a 60-metre single dolphin. That's now become an 85-metre double dolphin, though for the same cost. Do you have an option of putting a single dolphin in closer in, or is that ruled out because pretty quickly events are going to overtake us?
So just to clarify, the previous proposal for the single dolphin was situated 75 metres off the wharf. The current proposal for the two dolphins of smaller size than the original is that it would be situated between 80 and 85 metres off the wharf. The independent consultants suggested 82 metres as the distance. We need to do some design work and some simulation to prove that, but between 80 and 85. So it's between 5 and 10 metres further out than the original. Sorry, the question that you were specifically asking is whether a dolphin further
whether there
in
is
might...
another option of a single dolphin closer in.
The distance is in relation to the angles in which the lines need to come off the ship onto a bollard, in this case a capstan, which is an electric bollard of type, and that angle is one that's effectively agreed by the operators, and it's been positioned in a way that provides for the greatest degree of safety of the vessel at berth. So it would be difficult to suggest that, given the work that's been done by the independent consultants and by the technical advisors and the view of the harbour master and pilots, it would be difficult to suggest that it could be any closer than 75 metres to cater for the ovation of the sea, and between 80 and 85 to cater for oasis of the sea.
Thank you. My last question is referring to Appendix A of the Cruise Tourism's contribution to the economy by ME Consulting. It's projecting between last year's port calls and this year's bookings that the increase in the cruise industry in 1 year alone adds another 800 jobs to Auckland, adds another $100 million expenditure over last year, and another 60,000 passengers. Are those figures reliable?
My understanding is that was done on the forward estimates of bookings.
On bookings, yes.
Yep, the forward estimates of bookings, and those estimates get less reliable the further out you go from the current season. What we do know is that the 2018-19 season has currently booked 135 cruise ships, which is different to the port calls number that you see in that report, because it counts each vessel as a single visit, and that counts it as a double visit if it's exchanging, if that makes any sense. But there is no doubt that there is a year-by-year increase of both cruise bookings, ship visits, and passengers, and the economic value.
Okay, just to clarify, this report came out in August of this year. It's talking about the figures I'm quoting are from the 2017-18 bookings.
Yep, that would be fairly
that's,
firm. Yep.
That's next. That's now.
That's this year.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you would imagine. I mean, I really want to know whether we can rely on those figures, by and large. You know, give or take.
Yep.
Yes.
10 million or a.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's interesting that my question follows yours because I had some of what you've just asked were on my list. So my question is, if we're doing this to help the larger ships berth in Auckland, and the income of that berthing goes to Ports of Auckland, why aren't Ports of Auckland paying for it?
The arrangement with Ports of Auckland is they will collect the revenue because they have the ability to do so, and they will then provide that additional revenue back to parent council for the offsetting of the cost of the infrastructure. It's just the mechanism.
So they aren't.
But the practice is, they collect it, we're paying for the infrastructure, they will give us the levy that will then offset that investment cost.
Yes, but my question is, why aren't they paying for the infrastructure in the first place?
Well, we may well, this is a discussion we're yet to have, and they may well invest in the infrastructure and they can collect the levy and then repay the cost themselves. But in terms of our overall debt position, it makes no difference.
Yep.
I suppose my question is around, I'm hearing from your questions, Your Worship, that we're somewhat limited in our decision making based on what Ports of Auckland are saying they can do from a health and safety perspective, and the Harbour Master as well. So it kind of, you know, we're being asked to do something with limited detail around that. They've got all the decision making, well, majority of the decision making power. So I just, was wanting
I understand the frustration. I feel the pain. Thank you very much. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. And can I just say, I think that the report is very good, and I think that your addressing the questions has been very impressive. Can I, Attachment A is a very comprehensive document and well worth a read. With respect to, and addresses issues pertaining to safety and functionality, are you able to expand a little bit more on the relative efficiency of embarking and disembarking one of these cruise ships via a gangway rather than by tender? Because I think that's one of the issues that has emerged, is a relative challenge in terms of time and managing the flow of passengers via that means.
So the example that we have is when Ovation of the Seas was moored in the harbour over the last season, and passengers were tendered into the viaduct basin from that cruise ship. And whilst the the length of time that it took for a tender to come from the ship to the shore was not extensive, it does mean that the flow of passengers is much, much slower than if the ship was alongside and passengers were able to access, for example, Shed 10 at Queen's Wharf. And the length of time that it takes for a full ship for its passengers to actually come onto shore means that they have a really limited time ashore. And the shore excursions that are available to those passengers at that time are therefore much reduced from when a ship is alongside and they're able to very easily come and go from that ship during the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last question, Councillor Clow.
So I just observe, having been on a cruise ship once many years ago in the Caribbean, there's the flow back to and on the ship is often because lunch is on, and that's a fact. I have to ask, John, you made the point that there will be ongoing growth in the cruise activity. Just after the global financial crisis, was there a decline in the cruise ship activity around the world?
Yes, there was.
It was substantial?
It certainly slowed the growth and it took a chunk out of the existing market. But the cruise industry is very clever in being able to move its ships around the world to those parts of the world that are either safer if they're experiencing civil disobedience or terrorism in a particular location, or they have a higher yield in a particular region, they can move those vessels around, and they do that in order to ensure that they can continue to operate. Cruise ships are very rarely tied up and not doing anything.
But you do agree there was an economic impact, not a terrorist impact, from the global financial crisis that caused a decline, a substantial decline in the industry. That could happen again over the next few years, or certainly within a decade. These things go in cycles. I'm not asking you because that's a fact.
That's indeed the case.
Okay, let's
another
restrict the questions, please.
Yeah, well, sometimes the answers are circuitous. So we've indicated, and the Mayor just actually verified it with questions to you, that the big ships, or the great majority of the ships that are coming here that will be big, will not be for another 10 years. Then you agreed that Captain Cook could be developed within 10 years. So I just want to know, if we didn't have the Dolphin, what would be the percentage of the projected 10-year economic activity that we may lose by not having a Dolphin and waiting for a comprehensive development of Captain Cook?
So just to clarify, the current large ships that are coming here are 350 metres long. So those are the ones that started to come here last year. What we're suggesting is that the mooring Dolphin be designed and built in order to accommodate the next size of cruise ships as well as the ones that are currently coming here, which are 362 metres long. And the anticipation from the cruise industry is that they'll want to bring those here within the next 5 to 10 years. The economic impact, as I've indicated, the scenarios that we worked through with the cruise industry and market economics earlier this year suggest that without the fit for purpose infrastructure for these large ships, our economic benefit to the regional economy will be about half of what it would be if we had the infrastructure to provide for those.
About half.
Okay. Councillor Hills, is it a really important question? Because I'd like to try to get to the debate. Let me just put it to councillors. It seems to me that we should finish this item and have lunch before the next big item, which is the America's Cup. Are you happy to extend your time to do that?
Yes.
Fine. Can we make it quick, please, councillor?
No, yeah. I'm in a strange position where the facts say that this needs to be supported in the evidence, and I usually support evidence, but obviously there's a large cry from parts of the community, especially our local board has just presented, and the people who were against this last time were from my ward. But so I want to know, what is the other option? It seems like there isn't one, but also we talk about the effects on the economic activity, but are we factoring in the loss of or the cost to the harbour or anything like that of those large ships coming in? Is there an environmental cost? Are the other costs being taken in? And do we know? So is there another option to this if suddenly we refuse this today, or is this? You've kind of said we don't have an option, but
It's your dead rat.
In our view, councillor, we have exhausted every single option that we can think of and that we have been provided with by others, and all of the technical work that has been undertaken and the assessments lead us to this one particular option as something that is workable, functional, operationable, and able to be utilised with the approval of those parties who actually have to give agreement to it.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a good question. I'm suggesting now that we go straight into the discussion, and I have a call from Councillor Christabi.
It's just a question about the budget. To the motion on the B, Mr Mayor, it delegates authority to the Chief Executive, delivery and budget allocation. I just want clarification that that's not delegating confirmation of the budget. We are yet to do that. At the moment on our books we have a budget allocation for an embedded Dolphin. It's caveated that way. I want clarification that there is a future budget decision to be made at a Finance Committee.
Okay, I'll ask the Chief Executive to clarify that. John.
I was just going to make the comment that the budget for the mooring dolphin is included in the current annual plan, and that sits as a budget item available for use for this purpose. This particular set of recommendations would effectively suggest that the same budget can be utilised for what would be resolved by these recommendations.
So that budget allocation was caveated with the words inner dolphin, embedded dolphin. So you're saying that that can be applied without going back. The budget doesn't need to be raised because an amount is there, but it's not for this project.
Yeah. I think the answer, Councillor, is that if we pass these recommendations, that would override the restriction on the inner budget from the Planning Committee earlier in the year. Thank you. Okay, discussion with Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I would be happy to move these they're already moved. They're already moved. Well, in supporting them, can I just say that it's been really helpful to have the questions that fellow councillors have asked in terms of interrogation, because this is a very important matter. And may I really acknowledge you, John, for your calm manner. I mean, under the Perry Masons of this council, you have done extraordinarily well today. But the questions that I had around safety, functionality, the accountability issues, the integrity of the data, all of the things that have been the right questions to be answered have been explored. As I said to my colleague Richard Hills when he was asking, is there any other option? This is the dead rat that I recognise that we have to swallow if we want to see the continuation of last year, the 244,000 passenger port days, the 197 million that brought in, the thousands of people that this will employ, and all of the trends that we're forecasting that we have heard from you. I say thank you for the information, thank you to the officers, but in terms of the accountability, that was a real concern to me. It was good to get clarity around that, and I hope all councillors can support this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your really comprehensive report and the questions answered. There were some comments around the fact that we already have a waterfront plan. Yes, we do, but that's been somewhat compromised because of public opinion, and so we've had to start making some compromises. I mean, everybody is quite wary of extending wharfs at the moment. The port have pulled back from their extensions. So this is really a compromise to actually be able to enable a growing cruise ship industry. And as Councillor Fletcher says, it is a bit of a dead rat. We'll never please everybody. And we have pulled back from wharf extensions, reclamations, all of those things that the public are concerned about. However, we can't do nothing. You know, we've fought really hard to become a global city. We really have. There's been a huge amount of work. We are a global city now. And if we stop doing the things that continue to have it be that way, then we'll just become a backwater again. You know, we've increased tourism, we've had a lot of great opportunities because of the things that successive councils have done, and this council. So for me, there is not an option to do nothing. And we've heard that, you know, this is really a safety issue. And I don't think, you know, as the part owners of Queen's Wharf, the port don't own that wharf, we do. We own half of it with the government. So in terms of how, and it's not our workers that will be on that wharf trying to bob around on a little boat where we've heard there's very windy conditions at times. You know, the necessity for a gangway is a safety issue, and I wouldn't be prepared to propose a dolphin without that, because you're putting people's lives at risk, and that's not an option for me. We had a question by Cheryl Chambers around significance policy, and I'm sure if it did trigger that, that would have been brought to our attention, but I'm pleased to hear that it will be publicly notified. People will have a chance to have their say around this, so, you know, it will be transparent and the public will get a chance to have a say. The other issue for me is around future-proofing. If we can do, you know, between 5 and 10 metres longer for the same price or comparable prices we could do the shorter wharf, and we have no certainty about Captain Cook Wharf extensions because the public pressure to not extend, I don't think it will abate. So to me, the longer option is preferable, and that's why I've seconded this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Are there any... Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, my comment and hopefully assurance that I will get is around Māori impact statement. Now, I note in 24 that the engagement had been previously undertaken. I am asking your assurance that any consultation, whether about the further plan and especially around this particular issue, that I am assured that mana whenua will be consulted, and if we do not get mana whenua, all of them attending, is that there will be follow-up to the mana whenua groups that did not attend, because Chair, as you know, and I mean, I think it was a confidential workshop, so it won't be sort of mentioned, but we had co-chairs come through, and the comments I heard after that was that if mana whenua is key in regards to engagement, and that let's not just use some other the forums that other units may be going to and use that as consultation with mana whenua. And I think the other point that was raised at that particular workshop was that let's not use these groups, and that's the be-all and end-all with consultation with mana whenua. There's that there are 19, and so therefore the 19 should be consulted if that is their choice. So I'm hoping that I'm getting your assurance that that's exactly what's going to happen around any of the developments moving forward, especially to 2021, which is, I know, Your Worship, is the next item, but this particular one especially around the dolphin. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Christabi.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, thanks, John. This has been a tough one for you for well over a year now, year and a half or so. And Dean, thanks for dealing with it. And Mayor Goff, you've been given a serve on this one because it didn't start on your watch, it started before your watch. But it started on my watch, and I'm not happy with the direction that we're taking here. And you probably got that sense from my questions and my recent engagement. Ordinarily, this is the remit of the Planning Committee, but it's been pulled in here. The Planning Committee, as you asked me, Mayor Goff, was to pull all the threads of the waterfront together, stop the ad hoc reactive works and plans inverted commas, and pull it all together. And we've been doing that over the last, particularly over the last 6 months, with preparatory work being undertaken by staff and forming all that work. But let's just reflect first. And Fort Street is where the waterfront of Auckland used to be. Fort Street, imagine it. And then if you go along for our next topic, item 14, let's think about Victoria Street at Victoria Park on the southern edge as being waterfront. And we've just kept running out incrementally in planned and ad hoc ways. We've just stretched the landward edge out well more than a kilometre. Hundreds of hectares have been occupied of the Wainemata. And in 2015, the Bledisloe extensions were, and they were reclamations and wharves of 96 and 102 metres. Thousands came out in protest. That was an uncomfortable time for me around this table, and I had to work against my good colleagues who I've had good relationships with and will continue to have good relationships with, because we had a different point of view on that. And ultimately, I became the political lead out there, along with another particular political lead, which I'll come to. And we took to the podium in front of 5,000 people down at Queen's Wharf, hundreds out on boats behind, and there was Chris Dixon, America's Cup champion, on the podium speaking, Pete Montgomery, the voice of yachting, speaking against incursions into the harbour. There was Nikki Kay, the Auckland Central MP, and a young woman, Millie Goldwater, representing the youth, the future of Auckland. And the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron were in those boats, as I mentioned. It was me, and then we turned up another month later to another protest, and there was one MP that was always on the podium and spoke, the only other MP that spoke at both events. And that list MP is now the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she was vehemently opposed to further harbour incursions. And I'm sure she and her cabinet will be watching this decision as well. Ultimately, the courts decided, and the consents were annulled, and Aucklanders assumed at that time a line had been drawn. A line had been drawn, and ocean sprawl, as we've seen for 150 years, was at an end. But this time, it's not the ports of Auckland that are to blame. It's this council signing off on further harbour incursions, and that is of great concern to me. I just want to discuss what mega cruise looks like, because it's not mentioned anywhere in this report, in the economic impact assessment, the cost-benefit analysis. The economic benefits are mentioned, the disbenefits, the costs of cruise are nowhere mentioned. So these are gargantuan ships. They are 16 levels high. They are a floating city of people. Harmony of the Seas, an Oasis-class vessel, which was launched earlier this year, contains 8,800 people floating along. It's like a massive apartment building on its side, 2,000 to 3,000 cabins. You get a sense of the enormity of what Super Cruise is all about. And how are they powered along the seas? They don't use 95 octane, low leaded. They use crude, heavy fuel oil. It's a bit like a refined tar.
Marmite.
And it contains sulphur at levels that are 3,500 times what you will find in today's diesel that we buy at the pump. 3,500 times. And you might think, that's just while they're at sea, councillor. Out of range, out of mind, not of our interest. They continue to burn that in port. These are supersized polluters on the oceans and in our ports, and they have a significant environmental footprint. There is no strategy and no sustainability plan around cruise for Auckland, let alone New Zealand. I was relieved to see the new Minister, Kelvin Davis, talk about a sustainable tourism plan. We don't have one for Auckland. Mr Mayor, there's been no engagement with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. Fullers have told me they have had no meaningful engagement. There are 90,000 ferry journeys that come around the point of Queen's Wharf. 90,000 journeys.
Point of order, Councillor
And I hate to do this, Chris, only because I just want to put in, I think we need to put an extension of 2 minutes. So this is the point of order.
Hoping the member was winding up. Does he need an extension?
Oh, I'm sure he does.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded.
Two minutes.
There is an extension. Those in favour,
minutes.
please say aye. To the contrary, no. Extension granted. 2 minutes, please, Chris.
I thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I put
90,000 ferry journeys, 250 a day, come from the east. That's just the eastern ferries. It's not just the Kia, John. It's 90,000 a year. And the Chief Executive of Fuller's has confirmed to me today, and he's allowed me to convey this information to this forum, that there has been no meaningful engagement with them at all. The assessment, our market economics assessment goes out, and we're told that 2030, this is the interim use. That's 11 years of use. That's all that we're getting out of it. This is as permanent as it will come. This will not be taken out of our harbour anytime soon, because there's no account in the market economics work for the removal costs. Mr Chair, Council risks being as reactive here as its predecessor councils have been over 150 years. 85 metres out into the harbour, we're chasing the money. It's all about the money. It's not about the future of Auckland here. And just as we've always done, we've put jobs first, economic uplift to the forefront, and that should be considered. But unfortunately, we are not looking at a long future here whatsoever. So who is going to defend the harbour? We said we were going to defend the harbour, but when it comes to the hard decisions, the defences fall away. And I don't think we can make excuses anymore. The ocean sprawl that has occurred in Auckland has to halt. It just has to halt. So where are we going to put our votes now? Are we going to just sit with another small excuse like our predecessor councils, or are we going to hold firm in our defence?
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Ross-Clow.
Yeah, I'm really struggling with this. Because I totally understand the economic and the employment benefits are substantial, and it's not to be ignored. But it's the ad hoc nature, the reactive nature, for what we're doing here. And what's going to be left with Queen's Wharf afterwards? The best plan I've seen for Queen's Wharf was basically a people's park with a total vista up Queen Street, and then coming down Queen Street, you're looking out across, but we're just not getting anywhere close. I have a question, and I'm quite ignorant about this, but John, you mentioned that we have applied for a permanent resource consent.
Point of order, if I might interrupt. We've had the period of question
Okay,
time.
well, I'll
The
move
standing
it.
orders
I
now
will
don't
move, yep.
allow our officials to come back into the debate.
Okay, well, I'll move it. I'll give notice that I'm going to move an amendment, and I'll get the correct wording from someone.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Mr Mayor and members. This week, two important events occurred. The release of property revaluations, which will have a significant impact on rating in some areas, but also reminded us how valuable real estate has become in Auckland, and we can discuss why, but the point I want to make is that the sea itself, the waterfront itself, the harbour edge itself is enormously valuable and potentially valuable real estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And this week also we signed off at the Hauraki Gulf Forum the 3-yearly State of the Hauraki Gulf environmental report, which is going off to the Minister of Conservation as it must under the legislation. And one of the key concerns, Councillor Darby has referred to it, in that report is growing marine sprawl. Now, we still have in our minds what happened 2 years ago regarding Bledisloe Wharf, where this council doubled down on supporting the ports of Auckland and lost a celebrated case in the High Court. All the experts and legal advice said we would win it, and we didn't, because we were offside of the law, and also, unfortunately, offside of the majority of Aucklanders. Again, Councillor Darby has talked about that. Now, the dolphin. What I'm concerned about is the advice we've been getting. And it struck me as interesting that amongst all these expensive, independent, so-called, consultants' reports, there's no mention at all of what happens in our sister harbour of Sydney, which, as we all know, is very similar to Auckland, but on a bigger scale, also has growing cruise ship visits, also is under pressure from the cruise ship companies, do this or do that, otherwise we'll go to New Zealand. However, Sydney, just with a lot of its other infrastructure, is somewhat ahead of Auckland. It does have a dolphin, and a dolphin is simply a buoy that sits in the harbour but is affixed to the seafloor and is strong enough to moor big ships. Now, what I find really interesting amongst all these examples is there's not one example, or not one reference to the circular quay dolphin, which does not have a so-called walkway or jetty or whatever, but just sits as a buoy in the harbour, and from time to time is used, such as when the Ovation of the Sea turned up in Sydney. It's not used much, but it's there, and it doesn't have a high visible impact. And you couldn't argue that it's a wharf extension or creating real estate, or really, I suppose, harbour sprawl. But what we've been advised to do here is to extend Queen's Wharf significantly. And it's almost as if we've got a tin ear when it comes to the people of Auckland. They've made it very clear that they don't want more harbour sprawl. Even Ports of Auckland, a group of business people, have heard what the public is saying and have changed their policy formally. The Chair, Liz Coots, recently announced, we hear what the people of Auckland have said. We are no longer going to be pushing to extend the port into the harbour. Now, a lot of advice in regard to this extension of Queen's Wharf, and that's what it is. 75 metres or 85 metres did come from the Ports of Auckland, and I have to say, at the time, when Ports of Auckland were pushing very, very hard and pushing this council successfully to support their expansion of Bledisloe Wharf. And what an ideal opportunity to assist their own plans, but to advise people in our CCOs that, yes, the only way you can have a dolphin is by having a wharf extension, and that is nonsense.
Councillor, do you require an extension, or are you ready to wind up?
I think I do, but I won't be too long.
It's been moved and seconded. I'll put it to the vote. Those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Another 2 minutes, Councillor.
Now, I have been a very strong supporter of the cruise ship industry over the years. I see a lot of benefits in it. But just with everything, you can have too much of a good thing. And one thing we want to avoid in Auckland is industrial level cruise ship activity, such as we've seen in the Mediterranean, where the local people line up and demonstrate and boo at visitors coming in. We don't want that. We want a sustainable relationship with cruise shipping, one that assists Auckland and does not damage our harbour, and one that our economy will benefit from and not lose from. So, you know, I support the idea that we need to come up with a balance, but not take a position that whatever the cruise ship industry demands, or anyone else, yes, yes sir, 3 bags full, will do anything. That is not our role. And in terms of the Resource Management Act and sustainable management of natural and physical resources, and the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act, and that is not the law either. And so what I'm asking, Mr Mayor, is that we do not accept what is in effect an extension of Queen's Wharf. I happen to disagree with officers' plans and the council's plans to move cruise shipping from Queen's Wharf and extend Captain Cook Wharf. Again, the tin ear. They haven't heard the public. You know, people disapprove of the port doing this, but when it comes to us, it's okay. We can do what we want, so we think. But I do not support that, but it seems to me crazy to spend all this money and intrude on the harbour even further on a temporary basis. I mean, where's the logic in that? So,
Councillor, could you please wind up now? You've exhausted the extension.
Okay. What I suggest, Mr Mayor, is before you recommend this, that you pull those recommendations and you go over to Sydney and talk to those people over there how they can run a cruise shipping without extending Circular Quay. They have a simple...
Councillor, thank you. We understood, and I even agree with that point.
Point of order. Point of order.
Yep.
I move that the motion now be put.
No.
You have to.
Right. We can move it, but let me
I have, for a point of order, I foreshadowed an amendment.
Yeah, there's an amendment foreshadowed, and I'm not sure yet that there's only another couple of calls being made, and I want to hear a full argument, Councillor. I think you voted for the extension of time for some of those that had spoken. I want to give some that haven't had the chance to speak. Could I have Councillor Newman, please?
Chair, I won't... the expansion of Auckland's CBD beyond Fort Street and Victoria Park enabled the expansion of Auckland's mercantile hub. And it enabled the expansion, it enabled the construction of industry, which is commercial property. I mean, commercial property is one of those core functions that enables industry to thrive, and we have a better Auckland CBD for that. I wholly accept Councillor Mike Lee's point about the value of the harbour. The harbour's value is precisely the reason, or one of the core reasons, why we have a cruise industry in Auckland in the first place. I represent a corner of Auckland where we really need employment pathways for our young people. We absolutely do. Employment pathways and access to higher wage and salaried positions is of critical importance to me as a ward councillor for one of those areas of Auckland that is overrepresented in statistics of economic deprivation, Your Worship. In some respects, the order of business today denies a discussion around one of the key points that's coming up, but in item 14 there's a wonderful reference in a report. I just want to read that out with your indulgence, Your Worship. It won't take long. It said, Auckland recorded over 244,000 passenger port days. This is estimated to have added to the local economy to the value of 197 million, while supporting employment of over 3,100 people within the Auckland region. These figures are estimated to grow to 245 million and 3,900 people respectively for the 2017-18 season, and 281 million and 4,500 people for the 2018-19 season. In conclusion, Your Worship, tenders in the harbour are no substitute for to berthing cruise ships at our harbour edge to enable passengers to embark and disembark. Tenders are appropriate in places like Dravuni Island and Denarau and Port Vila, but Auckland is New Zealand's international city, and we ought to have the physical infrastructure in place to complement a very valuable industry that generates revenue, it generates economic activity and dynamism, and generates jobs, some of which I want for my constituents in Manireo and Papakura.
Thank you very much. Councillor Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And Councillor Newman has just used some of the figures that I was about to quote. So we're looking at 50% increased employment, 25% more visits, and between 20 and 35% increase in economic activity. Cruise has changed, and it will continue to evolve. It has got bigger, but it's also got a smaller end of high luxury ships that are coming here. We need to increase the berthage capacity for the large ships, but also for the small, because the sheer volume and the economic uplift that comes with that. The other point, very briefly, is cruise is all about the environment. The cruise ships currently now, I have the figures here, are putting a thing called scrubbers into their exhaust systems, and 40.41% ships are fitted with exhaust gas cleaning systems. And there's a further 26 that are putting in new open loop systems, and I don't know what that means. But this is from the cruise industry that they are working to resolve some of their own environmental issues. And when you go on a cruise, they are very strongly promoting environmental outcomes for that particular experience that you're taking on, whether it's in Alaska or Milford Sound. So there are advantages. This is a consequence of using those advantages to take up the opportunities that cruise can bring for Auckland and for New Zealand. And the biggest opportunity we are going to get is we become a start and end port. Because then you get more visitor stay nights, you get more opportunities and a greatly enhanced economic outcome for the city and the country. That's the critical point.
Way they get on
Being a big
tours to our
cruises starting in Auckland and finishing in Auckland, that's our advantage.
Thank you very much. We have an amendment that has been moved by Councillor Ross Close, so I'll ask him to speak to that, and councillors will, we've gone through the debate, but councillors have the opportunity if they wish to speak again, but preferably, I think the amendment is pretty self-explanatory. But Councillor Close? Oh, you need a seconder. Is there a seconder? Oh, why don't you read it out? So I'll read it out. That the governing body approve resolutions A to D, subject to council undertaking to remove the Queen's Wharf mooring dolphin upon redevelopment of Captain Cook Wharf that meets the requirements of the cruise industry. Do I have a seconder for that?
Can I just ask a question? I might want to, just in terms of that, because this is whether I second it or not, just like anything else with our port at the moment, we don't know what is happening. If it could be that, I suppose, is it okay to ask the staff about this one, because it is a bit predicated on whether I second it?
Yeah, look, I think that would be justified in the circumstances.
Okay, just in terms of, if it came to 12, 10, 15 years away, and both were required for some reason, the extension and the mooring, I mean, is that a consideration, tying a future council down to having to remove it when it actually may be still required alongside extension? That's what I don't want to hold a future council to that far out. But
so I'm happy to respond to that if that's okay, Chair, because I discussed that very issue with Councillor Clow when discussing the matter with him. My expectation at the time will be that the council that governs will review where you're at with your cruise industry, the technology, the opportunity, and if you needed to, then you would rescind that. But what you are doing through that proposed amendment is sending a clear message of your intentions.
I'll second it on that. I'll second it on that basis.
So we've got the amendment on the floor now. Councillor Clow, if you'd like to speak to it.
Look, I'll be brief. I'm trying to reach a compromise here that recognise the economic benefits of the cruise industry, and I totally understand we're a hub for it, and I totally understand it's better to be connected to the land so we can replenish not only the supplies but also the people that are changing at the boat, because that's one big thing we're missing out here in Auckland, is we're not getting that turnover that we could increase. So I'm more than aware of that, but I'm just there's been several of us around here, and Councillor Darby, it's his role under planning, but I mean, I'm aghast at this ad hocery all the time that we're doing with our port, and that's what I don't want to see us locking ourselves into. So, I mean, as I say, the Queen's Wharf, and the best iteration we've seen of the Queen's Wharf, it's going to be the People's Wharf. And you don't want a dolphin there full time. If you're going to move it, you can still have it. You can still have the cruise industry there with the smaller boats in time going forward. But we remove the eyesore, which is the dolphin, and we just make that particular extension into the harbour temporary. So I'm just trying to reach a compromise here, folks. And as Mr. Kimpton said, it's sending a clear signal of good faith to a whole lot of entities that we're trying to do the best thing here. So that's all I'll say, and I don't need to have a right of reply.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and for your efforts to strike a compromise. I've got Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, I'm only wanting to speak to E. I'm concerned that E is effectively a substituted motion because it makes reference to A to D. I'm very uncomfortable with that. I would suggest that that amendment could remove the reference to A to D and stand on its own.
Thank you.
Otherwise, if it is to be a substituted motion, it requires the agreement of the mover and the seconder of the original motion. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my view of that.
Thank you. Well, as the mover, I'm happy to accept that. Councillor Watson.
Yeah,
Still
thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's an admirable intent of Councillor Clow to try and come to, well, not quite a compromise. Compromise not quite the right word, but to try and give some sort of reassurance. But I don't think we can give that sort of reassurance. A number of councillors have referred to, you know, the necessity of swallowing a dead rat without it really spelling out what that dead rat will look like. I was down on Princess Wharf yesterday looking across towards Queen's Wharf, and the simulation we saw was, you know, poor. We couldn't see anything with that at all. To have a structure, a dolphin and a walkway 85 metres out into the harbour is a significant effect on the visual aesthetic of that area, and that's a prime part of downtown Auckland, the Queen's Wharf. So, you know, it's all very well talking about what we have to do in terms of economic imperatives, but there is going to be a cost, a very significant visual cost in the prime downtown area of Auckland. The Queen's Wharf, 85 metres out. In fact, if you look at some of the other reports that were in our 400-odd pages, there's reference to the dolphin and walkway will be around about 500 square metres. There'll be a 50-metre exclusion zone around the mooring dolphin. Nearly a hectare will be removed from recreational use. Councillor Darby referred to the effect on the ferry traffic, and if you put in that exclusion zone, that's going out 140 metres. If you look at the way the ferries go, and we did have it, that will require quite a sharp right-hand turn when they're coming in. I don't know what it does to the flow of traffic. We endeavoured, Councillor Walker and I, to talk to some of the ferry skippers there, and they were certainly uncertain as to how it would affect them. So that's a relatively lesser consideration to the visual aesthetic. But the other thing, and I think Councillor Lee alluded to it, was how fickle the cruise industry can be. I mean, in Australia, earlier this year, the biggest cruise companies just stopped going, or announced they've stopped going. They're going to go to China and Singapore instead. There's talk of, you know, trying to get the Garden Island facility with the Royal the Royal Australian Navy. So they change. If it takes their hump, they'll go somewhere else, and they'll go there quick. But I guess when it's all said and done, and what I don't think has been made sufficiently clear is that visual aesthetic. There was no real expert or evidence given on that for us to see. We're going to, in all likelihood, probably vote that through without really seeing the visual consequences of what we're doing for an indeterminate period of time, irrespective of what Councillor Clow is trying to do here. So I'm really uncomfortable with this, especially as it follows on from you know, the controversy a couple of years back. And the public essentially have been shut out of things altogether in terms of being able to make meaningful input. So I have really strong reservations about this.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Lee.
I can understand the intention of Councillor Clow as to try and reach a compromise here, but actually a promised removal of the 85-metre extension into the harbour once we achieve a much greater extension of Captain Cook Wharf is not a compromise. I don't buy it, and I don't think the people of Auckland will buy that either. No deal.
Okay, I'll just speak briefly to it. Oh, sorry, Councillor Darby.
Look, I'll say briefly, look, I appreciate Councillor Clow trying to placate things here, but for me this is not a signal. This is a sort of a puffy smoke signal, really. This doesn't affect things whatsoever, but it could actually undermine the business case when we go to embark on Captain Cook, because we've got the existing infrastructure. So your business case at that time becomes weakened because you've got this new infrastructure already in place, and it has a life much longer than the life that we're confirming it.
Thank you. I'll just speak briefly on the amendment. I'm happy to accept the amendment as the mover of the original motion, and to accept it in the, I think, with the good faith in which the amendment's been put forward, which is once you may need the infrastructure now, but you don't leave your harbour littered with infrastructure you no longer need. That's why we need to take down things like Marsden Wharf and some of those other infrastructure that are already in place, and we will do that. I'm wanting to try to balance a protection of our environment with the need for jobs. I look across at my colleagues from South Auckland, and, you know, if we say we've got 800 extra jobs that might be coming next year, but we're prepared to give that away, that's easy for those of us that are quite well off and well employed and middle class. I'm interested in the kids out there, and I went with Councillor Darby and Councillor Hills the other night to a function where we were working with employers dealing with kids that were not in employment, education and training. And before I turn down the growth in jobs from a proposed, from having a growth in the cruise industry, I've got to think who that impacts on. I've got to think about the social conscience that we need to exercise to protect the right of all of our people to work. I've fought all my life for that, and I'm not going to change it now. So I accept the amendment. I accept that when this is no longer needed, it should go, and I'm happy to accept that as part of the motion. Right.
By division.
Actually, we've got to put it as amendment now.
By division.
And ask for a division. So I'll ask officers to have a vote by division on the amendment.
The councillors, you're voting on the amendment by Councillor Clow. Mayor Goff.
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Yes.
Councillor Clow.
Yes.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Cooper.
For.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipaina.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Councillor Hills.
Against.
Councillor Hulse.
Aye.
Councillor Lee.
No.
Councillor Newman.
Against.
Councillor Quacks.
No.
Councillor Sayers.
Against.
Councillor Simpson.
For.
Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Sir John Walker.
Against.
Councillor Wayne Walker. Councillor Watson.
No.
Look, it's a colour, nothing
Okay, declare the amendment lost by 7 votes to 12. We come back to the main motion, and I have no other councillors, so I'm going to. I didn't exercise the right to speak, but I will exercise a right to reply as the mover of the motion. As Councillor Darby pointed out, this is a debate that preceded this term of council and me. And I believe that it's now time to resolve it one way or the other. We simply can't keep on calling for further reports. We've got all the reports we need, we've got the information we need, and it becomes a value judgment as to how councillors choose to vote on this. I want to make it clear that this proposal wasn't my favourite option. I'm on record countless times, and John will attest to this. Like Councillor Lee, I struggle to find the justification for a walkway, and I know in Sydney they don't have one. But when I've done my homework on this, I find that we are not able to tell the harbour master whether or not we need a dolphin. There are other points of view on whether an inner dolphin might have worked. That was where I was placed and some of the people in the cruise industry. But that's not our decision here today. And I'm not in a position, unfortunately, to dictate to the ports of Auckland on how they read their health and safety requirements. So the resolution and the proposal is what it is. During the election campaign, I made it absolutely clear I was not prepared to see further reclamation of the harbour to store containers or to store cars, and I stand by that. And this motion, Councillor Lee, is not about reclamation. It's about a dolphin that is, as you properly described it, a buoy anchored to the floor, unfortunately with a walkway in between.
Extension, just like Bledisloe was.
I'm sorry,
just
Councillor.
like Bledisloe was.
I would ask you not to interject. Everybody respected
my name.
Everybody respected your right to speak.
You mentioned my name
when you were speaking, and nobody interjected on you. I asked for the same courtesy. So this is not a reclamation. This is a dolphin that can be put in place, and actually with or without the resolution that Councillor Clow moved, can be removed if and when it is no longer required. I want to say what we're weighing up here is what we lose if we vote against this resolution, because I want every councillor to be quite clear on the implications of their vote on this issue. We have had clear economic reports that have been commissioned independently and that we are told we can rely on. The figures differ somewhat, but they all say the same thing. They say that the growth in this industry is producing hundreds, if not thousands, more jobs, bringing hundreds of millions more in expenditure to this city, and I want that for the people of our city. I don't want our kids to be unemployed. I want to create the jobs. We might be having an economic boom at the moment, but if that boom goes away, then I don't want to start focusing then about why we didn't create the jobs that can be created or the prosperity for the city. So I feel very strongly about that. We need to know that if we vote down this decision, not only will the big ships not come here, but with the big ships increasingly replacing the medium-sized ships, we'll be getting less ships. I think John Smith spelled it out pretty clearly to us. The economic impact of this would be at best a flat line and not to get any of the growth that's projected, at worst to halve the economic benefits that the city is currently getting. So be sure you know what you're voting for on this. Yes, I'd rather not have that anchored buoy out in the harbour 85 metres, and I'd certainly rather not have the gangway, but this has an economic cost to our city. And if we keep giving away economic opportunities, where does the prosperity come from to do the environmental and the social things that we desperately want to do for our city? So think very carefully before you vote down the jobs and the prosperity of the city, because our vote today matters. This is not just a vague principle. This is something that has a distinct economic impact. So everybody, look, I respect the views of my colleagues who have spoken around this table about their care for the harbour. It's one, Councillor Darby, you know I share very deeply with you. But this is a real-life decision that we have to make. And it's about people's well-being, it's about our economic well-being, it's about jobs and income for people. And at our peril, do we decide to take a decision that actually in future times, I believe we'll be condemned for, not thanked for. I feel very strongly about that issue. But this is a vote for you to make your decisions on now. All I'm asking councillors to do is think carefully about the implications of what you're doing. Don't do it without being aware that there is distinct and real and important costs if we decline this. So thank you very much for your indulgence on that. I think we'll probably want to vote by division on this.
On A, I think, Mr. Mayor. On a division on A.
Well, the others don't make sense without A.
Yeah. Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
So I'm asking for a
Division was
division
called.
on each, and we'll take them separately if that's what you'd like, councillor.
Point of order.
Division.
You called for a division. We don't have a debate after you called division on what we're going to have a divivision on.
That's exactly
They've
right.
been put as a
Understanding
group.
this.
So division is on the whole.
Yep.
All the
We got
on all
into a
the.
pickle on
Yep. Okay.
finance
Look,
by them
I'm
playing
happy. I'm happy to accept that if that's the will of councillors. Okay. Could I ask officers please to call a vote by division?
Mayor Goff,
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore,
Yes.
Councillor Clow,
Yes.
Councillor Collins,
Against.
Councillor Cooper,
For.
Councillor Darby,
Against.
Councillor Filipaina,
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher,
Yes.
Councillor Hills,
Yes.
Yes.
Councillor Holt,
Jobs
Aye.
for your youth.
Councillor Lee,
No.
Councillor Newman,
4.
Councillor Quacks,
Yes.
Councillor Sayers,
Or
Councillor Simpson, Councillor Stewart, Councillor Sir John Walker, Councillor Wayne Walker,
No.
Councillor Watson,
Against?
so I declare that motion carried by 4 votes to 5. Can I thank 14 votes to 5 would be a funny carrying if it was 4 votes to 5. 14 votes to 5. I recommend that we come back to discuss the next item on the agenda at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.